Today I want to talk about a genre I don't read all that much in, which is historical fiction. I'm not going to employ the Alan Moore defence of I like to give my opinion on things I'm badly informed. Um, I'm actually going to do full disclosure, which is that when I was at university I studied history, and it was that very disillusioning experience that meant I came out of university desperate to do something creative, and at the end of that sort of process, I turned into a novelist. Okay, so what are my problems with history? Um, it's often quoted that the victors make and write history, and in one sense that's true. If you think about something like the Wars of the Roses in England between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, ultimately the House of Lancaster won that, and they were the guys who got to write the chronicles, the histories, and also the architecture devoted and propagandising their victory and legitimising it. Shakespeare was a bit of a propagandist on their behalf with his portrayal of the cripple King Richard, who was from the other team. So in that sense, history is made by the victors, and that's sort of exacerbated by the duality of history. Is on the one hand, history is made by great men, important men, and unfortunately, historically, it always was men in the sense of kings, war leaders, politicians like prime ministers and things. But the other trend of history, of course, is it's made by great movements within the populations, within the masses. Um, Something like revolution, you need your Lenin to lead it, but obviously you need your support on the ground of people who form the Red Army. Um, and historically, the further back you go, those people left no historical record that's passed down to us because a lot of them were illiterate, or they just didn't have the economics to be spending time writing and leaving records. Obviously, as history sort of gets closer to the modern day, then everyone does leave records of some kind or the other. So on that level, history is written and made by the victors. But in fact, since the 20th century, history is not made by the victors, it's made by academic historians, um, in the sense that everybody now is leaving their record and propagandizing, and it's only this sort of priest caste of academic historians who go and look over all this source material and all these reports and decide what is historically legitimate and verifiable. And they would claim for themselves that history is almost a science, that it has sort of rigorous standards of proof of through documentation and sources and things like that. And hence it's a genuine academic pursuit. Um, but one thing that cuts against that is that history is actually made by the market, because academic historians are obliged to produce papers and publish books. And there's simply no point writing a book about something that a previous historian has said and just duplicating that argument. So therefore, the emphasis on a historian is to publish something new. That's either a new scene that hasn't been touched in history, or to take a new line on something that has a previously established orthodoxy. So in that sense, the market makes history as much as historians make it. Um, but the other thing is that historians are not neutral. They may claim to be, but they are not. And to give you an example of this, the British history I studied at school was from 1705, which is the first Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, up to just after the Second World War, and the suffragettes and universal suffrage. And that was always taught as a great period of constant progress of the sort of betterment of Britain, so that in 1832 there was the first extension of the right to vote, and up to obviously universal suffrage of just after the First World War, showed that this was a path to democracy, and it could only be viewed as progressive. And yet, when I went to university, they shifted the dates back by 17 years, so that I started the period at 1688 and it went up to 1832. And that was portrayed as a triumph of reactionaryism, that progressivism, didn't get a look in. And the reason for that is because the 1832 Great Reform Act actually choked off the public pressure for universal suffrage, and just made a very, very small concession by expanding the vote to the upper echelons of the middle classes. And both are informed by their political stance. History is not neutral, and historians are not neutral. And in that sense, history is a fiction. Um, to give you a sort of another sort of element of this is that I was taught that in history, psychology is not admissible. That history will only work with documents and source, i.e., a written record, which, as we know, is already patchy and partisan. But anyway, so you can't, Stalin was sort of paranoid and a psychopath, but you can't say that in history, which is slightly odd because psychology would claim the same sort of near science rigor for itself that history does. But anyway, but of course, historical fiction relies entirely on psychology, and because you're talking about the characters that are the protagonists of your book, and those characters are fleshed out in great detail and they have motives and all this sort of stuff, and that's the matter of the book, how these people think and move and operate. But that's bad history, and I think that's sort of sums up my problems with historical fiction, in that you can have a work of historical fiction that is good fiction but bad history, or it could be bad fiction but good history. And what I mean by that is academic history is actually really dry. Now, there are plenty of writers, historians, who have a bit of dash and elan in their writing style, but essentially it's quite dry because it aspires to this sort of pseudo-scientific rigour of proof of documents and sources. I keep saying. So that a work of historical fiction, if it's aspiring to real historical rigour, is probably going to be quite dry and not very interesting to read. And you may as well read a history book on the same period. Whereas a work of historical fiction that has great literary merit and great style and everything is a good read, but is probably pretty bad history. And again, it's probably going to have an emphasis on the psychology of the characters, because what would you have without that as a novel? So historical fiction for me is like really, really fraught. And then there's a distinction to be made, I think, between a historical fiction that consciously takes real life characters and events from history and tries to get back into that sort of mindset of how the people thought and felt, and to give a flavour of the times. And then there's novels that are set in the past, which aren't not looking to take real life characters and real life events. So I would offer an example of that as Patrick Susskind's Perfume, which is I think a great novel, but it's not a work of historical fiction. It's a novel that happens to be set in the past, which was necessary for the conceit of the guy who has this amazing sense of smell and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a difference there between historical fiction and work set in the past, and time is a very important element of all fiction, because even if you're writing a contemporary novel set in your own times, within one generation it's already become a work of history because the culture has moved on. So I may be writing with my audience in mind. I can't write something that's so alien to them that they just would reject it out of hand. So it has to be pitched within my time, which is a historical time, although it hasn't become historical until people looking back from the future to render it historical. Science fiction is a great litmus for this thing, in the sense of whenever you look back on science fiction that's been written in previous generations, you get a real sense of the times in which it was written, their anxieties, their fears, how they perceive the future development of technology. I mean, it's a real sort of microscope on that. So even in science fiction, which purports to be of the future, is fundamentally rooted in time and in historicism. Okay, so that's all by way of preamble. I want to talk about this book, HHhH, by French author Laurent Binet. It was his debut novel, and I want to talk about it because I think it brings together a lot of what I've been saying about history. It is about a historian who is trying to write the history of the assassination of the Nazi Richard Heydrich, who was the man who was put in charge of Prague, of occupied Prague, because it was proving quite difficult for the Nazis to control. And Heydrich was a complete animal. He sort of hung people from the lampposts and just all manners of brutalities to sort of get Prague under control. And the British sent 2 Czech agents over to Prague to assassinate him. And more by luck than judgment, they succeeded. And I say that because they shot him, but not fatally, except that he was in his car when they shot him, and some of the leather from his seat managed to get into his bloodstream from the wound, and blood poisoning was in fact what eventually killed him. So they sort of got rather lucky in that. So the book sort of portrays a lot of that history as if a historian was producing it, but the central focus is the historian. So it's definitely a work. It's a novel. It's not history, and I don't think it's historical fiction because the concentration is on the supposedly contemporary historian, not on Heydrich and those events. But why it's really interesting is what it's saying about the historian and the process of making history. So the first thing about the historian is you see him as a person and with all the foibles of humanity. So a rival academic publishes a thing which contains an argument which overlaps with part of what he's writing, and he gets very annoyed because basically this guy beat him to it, and he thinks, oh God, is that going to like junk my whole work now because this part of the argument is out of it. So there's sort of that sort of personal element of it. Then there's the as the book wears on, the historian abandons any sense of neutrality, and he is rooting for the Czech guys. We don't know much about these guys in reality. We don't know their stories, and the historian in this is trying to sort of enflesh them, sort of bring them to life, give them colour. Did they smoke a cigarette, sort of standing outside the plane that was going to transport them to Europe, and all that sort of stuff. So he's sort of built up these other sort of characters that he's fallen in love with, because they're his creations, but also because they're going to do a very good thing, which is assassinate, the worst, one of the worst of the Nazis. And morally, you can only really side with them. But, he is their cheerleader in his work. He sort of abandons any pretense to neutrality. And that sort of sums it up about historians, that they may claim they're neutral and sort of objective, but they're not. And this is a very sort of extreme case because, as I say, it's good versus evil, and there's in that sort of in his desire to sort of put make this a sort of to bring these characters to life. There's a section where he's talking about Himmler, who was Heydrich's boss, who sent him to Prague, and he goes something like he has this great desire to give Himmler a sort of a red nose from a cold, probably because he, the historian that day, was suffering from a cold, and he sort of ummed and ahed about it, and he put it in, and then he took it out, and he says, oh, so now I'm back to the problem where I've got this line, and I really feel I need something in the middle, which is what I thought was going to be the red nose of the cold, but that doesn't work. And then he quotes Oscar Wilde, who sort of said, I worked on a poem all morning, then when I came to look at it in the afternoon, I took out one comma, and then when I looked at it again, I put the comma back in. So this notion of creating, because you'll write history as a book that you're publishing, it has to have a style, it has to somehow come off the page so it's not dry and dreary. But these are creative, these are artistic, these are literary decisions, they're not history decisions. This is a really subversive book. I think it nails historical fiction for what it is. It also nails history. It definitely fits in with kind of my conclusions from my academic studies of it. I almost feel how can anyone go and write historical fiction after that? Because this is saying history is already a fiction. You don't need to fictionalise it formally in the form of historical fiction. And I think that's a message that sort of needs to get out there. It's called HHhH because there's there's a line in the book where Himmler's or Hitler's or anyway, some of the Nazis referred to Heydrich by saying Himmler's brain is called Heydrich, which in German, all four of the words that make up that sentence start with H, so HHhH. This is a fantastic read, very subversive. I'm in a later episode. I'm going to talk about Binet's follow-up novel called The Seventh Functional Language, which is brilliant in quite a different way. But this is his debut, and I would say start with this one. And if you're as impressed with it as I was, then go on to The Seventh Functional Language, which takes it on yet again. Okay, thanks. Till next time.